Echoes in the Deep Brine, Chapter 8. Ghosts in the Metal. The hum was the first lie. It was the sound of sterility, of recycled air pushing through HEPA filters, of server fans cooling the diagnostic suite, a low, constant thrum that promised control. Outside this polymer glass bubble, the protein refinery was dead silent. And that was the second, more profound lie. Log entry, cycle 83, post-containment, I spoke, my voice a dry monotone for the datapad's transcriber. The small red light on the console blinked in time with my words. Subject Group Alpha, the vocalization phase, or chanting, has ceased entirely. Subjects now exhibit signs consistent with advanced catatonia. Posture is rigid, unresponsive to external stimuli. Ocular fixation is uniform, directed to the southern wall of the main processing vat. I paused, watching them. 54 men and women, the entire third shift of Refinery 7. They stood on the rust-colored deck plating, spaced with an almost geometric precision. Not a single one slumped or swayed. They were statues carved from despair, slicked with the perpetual condensation of the bellows. The only light on their side of the glass was the sickly green-blue glow of fungal blooms creeping up the nutrient pipes, painting their pallid faces in shades of decay. My gaze swept across them, looking for a flaw in the pattern, a twitch, a cough, an individual deviation that would anchor this phenomenon in the comfortable realm of pathology. There was none. It was this perfection that scraped at the inside of my skull. Mass hysteria has a messy, chaotic signature. Neurotoxins produce tremors, spasms, a spectrum of symptoms. This was clean. It was orchestrated. Initial hypothesis remains neurotoxin-induced cognitive paralysis, with a secondary mimetic overlay causing the synchronized behavior. The cessation of chanting could indicate a burnout phase in the synaptic pathways, or a transition to a new stage of the delusion. Even as I said it, I knew how thin it sounded. A delusion requires a believer. These people were hollow. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, didn't seem to be looking at the wall so much as through it, focused on some distant point in the groaning, dripping darkness of Haven itself.
From the corner of the observation post, a heavy thud of a mag boot on the deck plating. Brekker shifted his weight, his augmented frame filling the cramped space. The scent of ozone from his integrated hardware momentarily overpowered the sterile air. He hadn't spoken in an hour, just stood there, his gaze fixed on the same silent tableau as mine. "This ain't right, Vask," he said, his voice a low gravel that vibrated through the metal floor. "The chanting was bad. This is worse." I didn't turn. Worse, Brekker, is not a clinical metric. It's an emotional response. What we are observing is a data void, nothing more. A static phase. It's frustrating, but it is not inherently more dangerous. They were singing before, yeah? A messed up one, but it was something. Sound. Life. This. He gestured with a thick-knuckled hand at the silent crowd. "This is like the pressure dropping before a hull breach. The air gets thin, and everything just stops." "An apt, if unscientific, metaphor," I said, tapping a command into the console. A thermal overlay shimmered across the main screen, painting the workers in cool blues and greens. Body temperatures are uniform, 89.6, all of them. Metabolism is depressed but stable. They aren't dying. They are waiting. Waiting for what? The rust to finally eat through the pylons? His unease was a palpable thing, a cloying humidity that the air purifiers couldn't scrub away. We should pull back, seal the whole level, let the directorate flood it with pacification gas, and be done with it. I finally turned to look at him. His face, usually a mask of hardened indifference, was tight with genuine concern. Lines were etched around his eyes. He saw people he might have known, damp skins from his own miserable stratum of this vertical city. I saw a data set that refused to be quantified. That is precisely the superstitious thinking that allows these outbreaks to fester. Metal hum madness, they call it down here, don't they? A ghost in the machine. You attribute malice to silence because your brain is hardwired to interpret patterns, and right now the pattern is one of absence. I gestured back to the screen. I am not here to manage ghosts. I am here to dissect a disease. To do that, I need to observe its entire life cycle. This stillness is a symptom, and I will classify it.
I felt a surge of my old confidence. This was my domain, the cold, hard logic of belief systems pathology. The silent choir, my last case, the failure. I pushed the memory down. This time would be different. This time I would be clinical, detached. Brekker just grunted, a sound of profound disagreement that needed no further words. He turned his attention back to the glass. Keep your footing, then, theologian. Just know when the floor is about to give way. I returned to my console, my fingers flying across the holographic interface, cross-referencing symptomologies from a dozen similar incidents across the last 50 years of arcology history, cognitive plagues, resonant psychoses, data stream-induced fugues. I would find a precedent. I would build a model. I would impose order on this quiet rebellion against reality. My focus was absolute. The world narrowed to the stream of data, the hum of the machine. The clinical annoyance I felt at the stubbornness of the problem was a familiar, almost comforting sensation. It was the feeling of a puzzle, and I was the master of puzzles. And then it happened. It wasn't a sound. It was a movement, a ripple through the silent crowd, so small and so perfectly synchronized that for a second my brain refused to process it. Every single head, all 54 of them, tilted, just 5 degrees to the left, in absolute unbroken mechanical unison. My hands froze over the console, my breath hitched. It was impossible. Catatonia is individual. Brain damage is unique to the brain. There is no physiological mechanism, no neurotoxin known to man that could network 54 separate human bodies with such microscopic precision. It wasn't a flock of birds turning in the wind. It was a single organism, wearing 54 skins, moving one of its limbs. The sterile hum of the observation post suddenly seemed thin, a pathetic attempt to ward off a silence that was not empty, but full of awaiting, patient intelligence. The cool blue thermal readings on the screen flickered, and for a half-second I thought I saw a spike, a phantom heat signature blooming in the center of the crowd, where nothing was.
I blinked, and it was gone. The workers remained, heads tilted, staring at the blank, weeping wall. The clinical annoyance in my gut had vanished. In its place, a cold, heavy stone of dread began to form. Brekker was right. This wasn't a data void. This was the held breath before the scream, and we were locked in the room with whatever was about to make it. The air in the makeshift observation post was thick enough to chew. It tasted of ozone from the overworked life support unit and the wet metallic tang of the bellows itself, a place perpetually sweating rust. A steady, maddening drip echoed from a corroded conduit overhead, each drop striking a puddle on the grated floor with a splash that seemed to measure out Joran's waning patience. He ran a hand over his face, the skin slick with a film of condensation, and stared through the polymer glass viewport. Beyond it lay the quarantined section of Protein Refinery 7. The official story was a catatonia halide neurotoxin leak, a convenient fiction. The reality was something else. Under the sickly green pulse of emergency lighting, 24 workers moved with a dreamlike, unnatural synchronicity. They weren't writhing or spasming. They were arranging. They lifted fallen pipes and twisted metal plates, not with the frenzy of the afflicted, but with the slow, deliberate purpose of artists. Their heads were cocked at the same precise angle, listening to a symphony only they could hear. The low, guttural chanting was a constant hum that vibrated through the glass, through the floor, and into the bones. It was a single, multi-throated voice. Joran turned as the holo emitter on the salvaged metal desk behind him chirped to life. A column of pale blue light solidified, resolving into the crisp, unnervingly perfect image of Otho Valerius. Otho sat in a chair that looked genuinely comfortable, the sterile white wall of his aerium office a stark insult to the decay surrounding Joran. Not a single bead of sweat marred his brow. His face, framed by silver hair cut with geometric precision, was a mask of placid authority. "Report, Vask," Otho said. His voice was smooth, filtered, devoid of the ambient noise of the arcology. It was the voice of a man who breathed different air. "Director Valerius," Joran began, his own voice sounding rough and damp by comparison. "The situation is anomalous. The subjects exhibit coordinated, complex behavior. They're constructing something. The chanting is not random. It's a modulated, resonant frequency. I've cross-referenced it with our mimetic hazard database. Nothing matches." He wanted to convey the sheer wrongness of it, the way their movements defied all known models of mass hysteria. He had seen riots, seen religious fervor, seen toxin-induced madness. This was none of those. This was organized. Otho held up a hand, a gesture of polite, absolute dismissal. "The chanting is a phonatory spasm, a known symptom of catatonia halide exposure at this concentration. The construction is punding, a complex, repetitive, non-goal-oriented motor behavior. It's all in the preliminary file I sent you." Joran felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. "Sir, with respect, punding is typically individual. This is collective. Their heart rates, their respiration, even their blink patterns are synchronizing. I've never seen biological data align this perfectly across 24 subjects without a neural interface. I need a full biotelemetry team and a spectrum analysis of the ambient sound." The request hung in the humid air between them. It was a direct challenge to the neat little box Otho had built around this crisis. Otho's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a thin, bloodless curve. "What you need, Joran, is to remember your function. You are a forensic theologian. You are dispatched to situations where belief systems, nascent, resurgent, or pathological, pose a threat to structured survivalism. Your job is to dismantle the narrative, not build a new one." Joran stared at the director's placid, hollow face. Dismantle the narrative. Sanitize, debunk, erase. Don't discover. Never discover. "The official narrative is a neurotoxin. Your report will analyze the emergent pseudo-religious behaviors, the chanting, the ritualistic arranging, as a direct and predictable consequence of that toxin. You will classify them, give them a clinical name, and recommend a standard deprogramming regimen for any survivors. Is that understood? Frustration burned hot in Joran's throat. It was the silent choir all over again, a different stage, a different cast, but the same script. A script that ended in tragedy because no one would listen to the details. The data doesn't entirely support that conclusion, Director. There's a mimetic component here, a powerful one. Ignoring it is prudent, Otho cut in sharply. The despair metrics in the bellows are already climbing. The last thing we need is a rumor about a chanting sickness. It invites belief. It creates an alternative to function. It is an existential contagion, Vask, and your job is to be the cure, not the carrier. He leaned forward, his perfect image shimmering slightly. I don't need your scientific curiosity. I need a clean report. I need this contained, explained, and filed. The authority requires stability. Hydrocorpus requires productivity. Neither has any room for ghost stories. Joran's gaze drifted back to the viewport. One of the workers, a woman with kelp fiber strands still woven into her hair, turned her head. For a terrifying second, her eyes seemed to meet his through the glass. They were wide, unfocused, but he felt a jolt of recognition, not of him, but through him, as if he were just another pane of glass. Then, in perfect unison, all 24 workers stopped moving. The rhythmic hum of their chanting ceased. The sudden silence was more horrifying than the noise. "What's happening?" Otho's voice broke the spell. Joran watched, his own heart hammering against his ribs. The workers all turned to face a specific point on the far wall of the refinery, a spot where dripping brine had encouraged a patch of pale, blue-glowing fungus to grow. They raised their hands as one, fingers splayed. "They're observing something," Joran whispered, leaning closer to the glass. "Or listening. Documented as a period of group catalepsy, another known symptom. Write the report, Joran. Submit it by 0600. I want this incident classified and archived before the next shift cycle. No more resources will be allocated. This is a simple matter of mental hygiene. Don't complicate." Joran didn't answer. He was watching the workers' hands. They were tracing patterns in the air, complex, looping shapes like twisted coral or tangled nerve fibers. And on the wall, the bioluminescent fungus seemed to pulse in time with their silent gestures, its glow intensifying, shifting from blue to a deep, unsettling violet. "Vask." "Acknowledged?" Otho pressed. Joran tore his eyes from the window. The frustration had cooled, solidifying into a hard, dense core of resentment in his gut. This wasn't hygiene. This was willful blindness, a deliberate, systemic refusal to see the monster in the room. "Yes, Director," Joran said, his voice flat and empty. "A clean report. I understand my function." "Good. See that you do. Your past successes have earned you some leeway, but that leeway is not infinite. Keep your footing." The column of light collapsed, taking Otho's sterile world with it. Joran was left alone in the dripping dark of his own. The hum of the life support unit seemed louder now, the groaning of the arcology's metal skeleton more pronounced. He stood there for a long time, the director's orders echoing in the oppressive silence. A clean report. A lie polished and packaged for public consumption. He turned his back on the dead hollow emitter and faced the viewport again. The workers were still tracing their silent, impossible language in the air. The violet light pulsed, soft and hypnotic. He wasn't a carrier, Otho had said. But as he watched the scene, a forbidden thought took root in his mind. Maybe the only way to cure a disease is to first understand what it believes. The silence from the refinery floor was louder than any alarm. On the dozen monitors arrayed before Joran, the quarantined workers stood as still as the corroded support pillars around them. 112 souls, frozen mid-frame. The air in the makeshift observation post was thick with the smell of ozone and hot dust from the overworked terminals, a smell layered over the permanent damp metal tang of the bellows. A rhythmic drip of condensation somewhere in the ceiling marked the only consistent sound, a slow, maddening metronome counting down to nothing. Joran leaned closer to the primary monitor, his reflection a pale ghost over the static figures. He tapped a command on his datapad, and biometric overlays shimmered into view. Heart rates, synchronized. Respiration, synchronized. Pupillary dilation, identical across 97% of the subjects. It wasn't the peace of meditation. It was the flatline stillness of a machine in standby mode. A contagion of the will. His contagion. This was a failure of containment. His methods, the sterile logic and aggressive isolation he'd imposed, had not cauterized the wound. They had merely driven the infection deeper, into some silent, communal space he couldn't access. "Anything?" Brekker's voice was a low rumble, cutting through the electronic hum. The enforcer stood with his arms crossed, his bulk a solid shadow against the sickly green glow of the screens. He wasn't looking at the biometrics, Joran noted. He was just watching the people. Phase-locked stillness, Joran murmured, more to himself than to Brekker. His fingers traced the cascading data. A shared catatonic state, precursor to something. He had seen it before in smaller groups, a communal pause before the system crashed, before the violent, self-destructive crescendo. His work was to predict and preempt that crescendo, to prevent another silent choir. "They look tired," Brekker said, his gaze fixed on a monitor showing a close-up of a young woman's face, her expression utterly vacant. Joran scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound. "That's a sentimental projection, Brekker. They aren't tired. They are nodes in a pathological network. The individual is suppressed. They are no longer people in the way you understand." As the last word left his lips, it happened. Not one of them, but all of them. On every screen, in perfect silent unison, 112 heads turned to face the central protein vat. It wasn't a human movement, full of subtle variations. It was the synchronized, frictionless pivot of a machine. The air in the room felt suddenly colder, the dripping louder. Joran's breath caught. His fingers froze over his datapad. He saw Brekker tense, his weight shifting onto the balls of his feet. "What was that?" the enforcer asked, his voice losing its casual tone. No signal, no leader. They just knew. "The network just broadcast an instruction," Joran said, forcing clinical detachment into his voice. The dread was a cold knot in his stomach. "The active phase is beginning. Ritualistic destruction." As if cued by his diagnosis, the workers began to move. They flowed toward the massive, algae-slick machinery of the refinery floor with a shared liquid grace. There was no shuffling, no hesitation. They converged on the nutrient reclamation pipes and the colossal cylindrical protein vats, the very heart of this level's food production. Jorn expected shouting, chaotic violence, the smashing of instruments against metal. He expected the usual primal scream of a belief system collapsing into psychosis. He saw none of it. A man with the wiry muscles of a pipe fitter approached a high-pressure valve that took 2 men and a torque wrench to operate. He placed his bare hands on the wheel. There was no grunt of effort, no strain on his face. Joran watched, mesmerized, as the valve spun smoothly, its locking mechanism groaning in protest before giving way with a sharp crack that echoed faintly through the monitor's cheap speaker. Nearby, 3 women worked in tandem to pry a heavy steel maintenance panel from the side of a vat. They moved with the effortless coordination of a surgical team, their hands finding purchase on microscopic seams, their combined strength applied in a single fluid motion. The half-ton panel lifted away as if it were polymer foam. "Note the synchronicity," Joran said, his voice a strained whisper. He was narrating his own failure. A classic hive mind symptom. They're dismantling their own life support. It's a purely pathological act. "No," Brekker said, his voice quiet but firm. He pointed a thick finger at a smaller secondary screen. Joran zoomed in. A group of 4 workers were on their hands and knees carefully unscrewing the deck plates. They weren't tearing them up. They were methodically removing each bolt, their fingers spinning the rusted metal with unnerving speed. Once a bolt was free, they placed it in a neat pile. Another worker was coiling stripped electrical wiring into perfect concentric circles. "They aren't destroying it, Doctor," Brekker stated, a note of alarmed wonder in his voice. "They're harvesting it." Joran stared at the screen, a flicker of irritation running through him. Harvesting? For what purpose? It's non-symbolic, non-ritualistic destruction. The pattern is just more complex than— "That's not destruction," Brekker cut him off, his eyes scanning across the dozen feeds. "I grew up in reclamation gangs. I know what taking something apart looks like. You smash what you don't need, you keep what you do. Look." He gestured to the main screen. The heavy panel the women had removed was being carried, not dropped, to the center of the room. The man who'd opened the valve was now directing the flow of residual nutrient slurry into a specific drainage grate, while another blocked the others with salvaged scraps. Every action was precise, efficient, productive. Joran felt a wave of cognitive dissonance so strong it was physically nauseating. His model, his entire framework for understanding these phenomena had no category for this. A mimetic plague was supposed to be a cognitive entropy bomb. It introduced noise, chaos, delusion. It broke systems down. It was not supposed to create a silent, coordinated, impossibly efficient construction crew. His gaze was drawn to the center of the processing floor. There, where the largest vat once stood, a new structure was taking shape. They were using the curved steel panels as a foundation, welding them together not with tools, but with some kind of secreted resin from their own hands that hardened instantly with a faint chemical shimmer. They were weaving the copper wiring through the structure like veins in a growing body. Others brought handfuls of the glowing blue-green fungus that grew in the damp corners of the refinery, pressing it into the seams of their creation. The structure was asymmetrical, alien. It resembled a massive half-formed piece of coral, its branches reaching for the dripping ceiling. And it was beginning to pulse with its own soft, internal light. "It's building something," Joran breathed. The word felt alien in his mouth. The dread in his gut had morphed into a sharp, intelligent alarm. This wasn't a riot. This wasn't mass hysteria. This was an infestation, following a blueprint he couldn't comprehend. "They're building a shrine," Brekker said, his voice barely a whisper. No, Jordan shot back, the denial automatic. A shrine is a symbolic focus. This is an apparatus, a machine. For what? He didn't dare ask himself. He zoomed the main camera in on one of the workers, a man carefully placing a sheet of salvaged polymer onto the growing structure. He focused on the man's hands. The skin was pale and waxy, and across his knuckles, faint, glowing blue lines pulsed in time with the light from the strange coral tower. The lines branched out like tiny veins of captured lightning, a perfect, terrifying match to the fungus they were using as mortar. The skin itself seemed wrong, thicker, harder, like the beginning of a chrysalis. Joran leaned back from the console, the ozone smell suddenly suffocating. His own hands felt cold. The reflection in the dark screen showed a man whose ironclad certainty had just been stripped to the bone, leaving only a chilling, profound confusion. The sickness wasn't just a pattern of behavior. It was a purpose, an alien purpose, using human hands as its tools. The silence in the stillness was a lie. It was a thick, heavy blanket woven from sounds so deep and constant they registered not in the ear, but in the bones. The thrum of distant titanic machinery, the slow groaning complaint of Haven's foundations settling deeper into the brine. And beneath it all, the unsettling quiet of the water itself, a dense, viscous fluid that lapped against the corroded plasteel of their makeshift hideout without a proper splash. Joran stared at the salvaged monitor, his reflection a ghostly mask floating over the static-laced image. The refinery's main processing floor. Hours ago, it had been a scene of chaotic, violent psychosis. Now the workers stood unnervingly still, scattered amongst the nutrient vats and conveyor belts like forgotten statues. Their stillness was a new kind of terror, a held breath. From the corner of the small, damp chamber, the rhythmic clicking of Gisla's datapad was the only sharp sound, a frantic counterpoint to the city's bass drone. Brekker stood by the archway leading deeper into the flooded substructure, his augmented frame silhouetted by the sickly blue glow of a fungal bloom. He was a monument to barely contained violence, yet his stillness was one of patience. He watched Joran watching the screen. Then it began. Not a sound from the room they were in, but from the tinny speakers wired to the monitor. A low hum. Joran didn't answer. His mind was racing, trying to fit this new data into his models of mimetic contagion. Pathological construction, a symptom of complex delusional systems. Building a nest, a shrine. He'd seen it before, crude effigies of scrap and bone. But not like this. Never with this efficiency, this engineering. The workers carried their harvested materials, gleaming pipes, curved plates of steel, lattices of rebar, to the center of the vast chamber, to the very spot on the wall they had been staring at during the initial outbreak. They laid the pieces on the floor, arranging them not in a heap, but in careful, deliberate patterns, a blueprint that only they could see. And then they began to build. The hum deepened, the harmonic structure growing more elaborate. It wasn't just coming from their throats anymore. The very air in the refinery, filtered through the monitor's cheap speakers, seemed to vibrate with it. The metal plates they held resonated, the sound emanating from the steel itself, a song of assembly. They lifted the first pieces into place against the wall. A spiraling lattice of pipe and steel began to grow. It wasn't a wall. It wasn't a shrine in any recognizable sense. It was architecture. But it was wrong. Joran's breath caught in his throat. A cold knot of genuine intellectual offense tightened in his gut. The structure defied the simple three-dimensional logic of the room around it. A pipe that should have been straight appeared to curve back on itself without a joint. A flat plate of steel seemed to present multiple surfaces to the camera at once. The monitor's low-resolution feed flickered and distorted around the edges of the growing object, pixels smearing as if the recording device itself couldn't process the information. What is that? Brekker's voice had lost its hard edge, replaced by a thread of pure disbelief. Non-Euclidean, Joran breathed, the words tasting like heresy on his tongue. He felt the profound personal violation. This was not a product of a diseased mind. A delusion could not bend light. A psychosis could not violate the fundamental laws of physical space. This was a tangible piece of impossibility growing in the heart of his meticulously organized case file.
He felt the rage then, cold and sharp. The same fury he felt when confronted by the unyielding, logic-proof certainty of a true believer. But this was worse. This belief was building itself into reality. It was mocking him. He pressed his fingers against the screen, the glass cold against his skin. The humming from the speakers filled their small, dark room, a choral symphony for the birth of a geometric monster. The metal they used, the pipes and plates, were from Haven. But the design, the physics of it was alien. It was the physical manifestation of the wrongness he had felt in the non-rippling fluid of the stillness. The memory of that baptism, of being forced under the surface of that dense, syrupy water, surged in his mind. The feeling of a cold that wasn't just temperature, but an absence. A pressure that wasn't just weight, but a presence. Brekker put a heavy prosthetic hand on his shoulder. The grip was firm, grounding. Vask, keep your footing. Joran flinched, snatching his hand back from the monitor as if it were burning hot. He looked away from the impossible image, his heart hammering against his ribs. The reflected glow of the screen danced in his wide, terrified eyes. They aren't just singing a song, he thought, a wave of nausea washing over him. They are tuning the world to it. The structure on the screen continued to grow, a spiraling metal coral reef of wrongness, humming its silent, impossible song directly into the part of his brain that understood numbers and laws. And for the first time, Joran felt the chilling, terrifying possibility that those laws were about to be repealed. The refinery floor was a cathedral of decay. Condensation wept down corrugated steel walls, tracing paths through layers of rust and grime. The air, thick enough to taste, was a foul cocktail of ozone from shorting conduits, the ever-present brine of the arcology's lower levels, and the sharp vegetative funk of the protein vats. At the center of the cavernous space, under the erratic flicker of a dying LED strip, stood the object of Joran's professional focus.
It was a sculpture of madness, a tangled nest of reclaimed piping, sheared-off catwalk gratings, and shimmering coils of fiber-optic cable, all woven together around the central pillar of a massive defunct nutrient processor. And around it, 47 workers from the morning shift stood in a silent, swaying circle. Their eyes were vacant, milky, fixed on the metallic effigy. A low, monophonic hum emanated from their chests, a sound so perfectly synchronized it seemed to come from a single, unseen source. It was the sound that had given the chanting sickness its name. "Pathological fetishism," Joran murmured, his gaze sweeping over them with the cold precision of a surgeon appraising a tumor. The structure acts as a focal point for the shared psychosis, a physical anchor for the cognitive contagion. He tapped the screen of his datapad. Biometric readouts scrolled by. Elevated cortisol, suppressed frontal lobe activity, synchronized heart rates. all textbook symptoms of severe, environmentally induced group hysteria. Beside him, Brekker shifted his weight. The corporate enforcer's bulk was a stark contrast to Joran's lean academic frame. His augmented arm, a lattice of dark chrome and synthetic muscle, whirred softly as he flexed his fingers. "They've been like that for 9 hours, Vask. No food, no water, just humming." His voice was a low rumble, steeped in the pragmatism of the bellows. "Are you sure about this sonic stuff? Seems like poking a rot-wasp nest." "It's not poking, Enforcer. It's de-patterning." Joran's tone was clipped, impatient. He was a man holding a scalpel, and Brekker was questioning the incision. "The frequency is designed to disrupt the neural feedback loop that sustains the trance state. It will induce cognitive dissonance, forcing a neurological reset. They'll wake up disoriented, nauseous, but lucid." He held up the datapad as if its glowing screen were a shield of absolute truth. "The data is unequivocal." This was his chance. A clean, controlled environment. A clear, diagnosable malady. Not like the silent choir. Not like the mess, the failure, the memory that festered in the dark hollows of his mind. This time, there would be no miscalculation. This time, logic would be absolute. He would excise the disease of faith and leave the host intact. "Initiating sequence," he said, his thumb hovering over the activation key on the datapad. "Stand clear of the barrier." Brekker took a half-step back, his expression a mask of hardened skepticism. Joran pressed the key. There was no immediate sound. Instead, a vibration started in the deck plates, a deep subharmonic thrum that resonated in the bones, in the teeth. It was the feeling of a colossal engine coming to life far below in the stillness. On the refinery floor, the humming of the workers faltered. A few of them blinked slowly, their heads tilting as if trying to locate a sound that was inside them. A thin, self-satisfied smile touched Joran's lips. Systemic disruption confirmed, he thought, already composing the first line of his report. Pathological resonance breaking down. But it wasn't breaking. It was changing. The faltering hum did not die. It found the new frequency, locked onto it, and began to climb. The low, monotonous chant spiraled upward in pitch, becoming a piercing, unified keen of pure agony. The workers' bodies went rigid. They didn't scatter. They didn't collapse. They all took a single, synchronized step toward the shrine, their hands flying to their heads as if to claw the unbearable sound out. Their mouths opened, and the keen became a shriek. It was a sound that didn't belong in a human throat, a sound of tearing metal and splitting nerves. "Joran, what is that? Shut it down," Brekker shouted, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm holstered on his tactical vest. "No, it should be working," Joran stammered, his knuckles white on the edges of the datapad. The biometric readings were a chaotic storm of red alerts. Tachycardia, neural cascade failure, massive bioenergy spikes. "This isn't possible." Then the light came. Not from the flickering LEDs above, but from the shrine itself. A faint, sickly blue line no thicker than a wire appeared on one of the rusted pipes. It pulsed, and another line branched from it, then another, and another, spreading across the metal structure in an instant. They weren't lights on the surface. They were lights within the metal, forming intricate coral-like patterns of bioluminescence that flared with impossible brilliance. The ozone smell in the air was suddenly overwhelmed by the scent of scorching metal and something else, something terrifyingly organic and sweet, like burning sugar and seawater.
The shrieking intensified, and the light leaped from the shrine to its worshippers. It started at their fingertips, where their hands were pressed to their temples. The same glowing blue patterns erupted on their skin, racing up their arms, branching across their chests and faces like incandescent frost. They weren't being burned, they were being rewritten. "Rust rot!" Brekker breathed, a word of pure, unadulterated horror. Joran could only stare, his mind a frantic, useless whirlwind of collapsing theories. Signal amplification, bioresonant cascade, impossible. The first worker fell forward. He didn't fall to the floor, he stumbled into the shrine, his hand slapping against a large curved plate of steel. And they didn't recoil, they stayed. His shrieking stopped, replaced by a wet, tearing sound. Joran watched, paralyzed, as the man's skin lost its color, paling to the flat gray of unpolished steel. His fingers seemed to melt, elongating and flowing into the metal plate, the glowing blue patterns on his arm now continuing onto the structure without a seam. His body began to dissolve, not with blood or violence, but with a horrifying placidity, like wax melting into a mold. He was being absorbed. One by one they followed. They pressed themselves against the pulsating, glowing edifice. Flesh lost its texture, becoming slick, metallic. Hair retracted. Limbs oozed with pipes. Torsos flattened and merged into the architecture of the shrine. The chorus of individual shrieks blended, modulated by the sonic disruptor's frequency into a single, complex, resonant chord. It was a sound of creation, a sound of birth. Joran fumbled with the datapad, his hands shaking violently. He jabbed at the screen. "Deactivate! Deactivate!" The subharmonic thrum of the disruptors ceased.
Where 47 people had stood, there was now only the shrine. But it was no longer a sculpture of scrap. It was a living thing. A single biomechanical organism, 20 feet tall, its surface a seamless pulsating canvas of warm metal and cool, glowing light. It pulsed with a soft, hypnotic rhythm, a great and terrible heart beating in the center of the refinery. It looked ancient and new at the same time, alive. Joran's breath hitched in his throat. The datapad slipped from his numb fingers, clattering uselessly to the grated floor. His scientific certainty, his entire worldview lay shattered with it. He had not come here to debunk a faith. He had not come to cure a sickness. He had come here with a tool of reason, and, like a fool striking a match in a gas-filled room, he had given it a god. The air in the makeshift observation post was thick enough to taste ozone, rust, and the hot metal stink of overloaded processors. Before Joran Vask, a dozen salvaged monitors flickered, a fragmented mosaic of pure, distilled horror. On the screens, the bellows-level protein refinery was no longer a place of work. It was a charnel house, an abattoir of reason. From the post's audio pickups came a symphony of damnation. The high-pitched, metallic screams of tortured souls mixed with the wet tearing sound of something new, a sound like gristle being wound through gears. Over it all, the deep, structural groan of the arcology itself, a bass note of constant, grinding despair. Joran kept his breathing steady, a measured, clinical rhythm against the chaos. Revulsion was a luxury. Fear was a data contaminant. He was a forensic theologian, and this was not a tragedy, it was a symptomology, a violent outbreak of a mimetic plague he was born to dissect. His eyes, dry from the screen glare, swept across the feeds. His mind automatically catalogued the horrors, stripping them of their emotional weight and filing them as data points. Monitor 3. A woman, her face a mask of terror, clawed at her own throat, not to stop a sound but to let one out. A harmonic drone that wasn't human. Her biometric feed, a tiny string of numbers in the corner of the screen, flatlined. But her throat continued to vibrate. Monitor 7. A knot of workers, their bodies jerking in grotesque synchronicity, were pushing themselves into a nutrient-paced extrusion valve. Not fighting, not struggling, but feeding themselves willingly to the machine. The machine, in turn, was shuddering, its metal skin beginning to warp, to pulse with a faint, sickly green light, as if digesting them. The beginnings of the shrine. Beside him, Brekker stood like a stone monolith, his augmented arm catching the monitor glare. The corporate enforcer didn't watch the screens with Joran's analytical coldness. He watched them with the grim stillness of a man looking at a wound he knew he'd be ordered to cauterize. "Rust rot," Brekker muttered, his voice a low gravel. "What is it, Vask? That neurotoxin they briefed us on?" "A neurotoxin doesn't teach people a new song," Joran said, without looking away from the screens. His fingers danced over the control panel, slick with his own sweat. He was hunting, panning, zooming, switching feeds. The screaming was noise. The terror was a distraction. In every outbreak, every ecstatic fit of faith, there was a core, a ritual, a performance. He was looking for the performer. He pushed past the close-ups of faces contorted in a mixture of agony and ecstasy. He ignored the newly formed biomechanical growths, the pulsing veins of fungal light that were beginning to crawl from the machinery onto the catwalks. It was all just the flowering of the disease. He needed the seed. "They said it was a leak from the kelp synthesizers," Brekker pressed, his gaze fixed on a man whose hands had fused into the corroded railing he was clutching. "The directorate says many things to maintain hygiene," Joran replied, his voice flat. He was a surgeon searching for the point of infection. Mass hysteria is a fire. It needs a spark. One person who believes, truly believes, and performs that belief for others to see. One patient zero. His own words hung in the air, echoing a past he kept locked away. A past of another choir, another failure. He pushed the thought down. Logic was the only clean tool he had left. And then he saw it. Monitor 4. A wide-angle shot of the main processing floor, partially obscured by a jet of scalding steam. Chaos reigned. Dampskins ran in every direction, some fleeing, some running towards the pulsating central machine, a maelstrom of panic. But not everyone.
"Isolate grids C-9, Joran commanded, his voice sharp. "Enhance." Brekker's thick fingers tapped at a secondary console. The image on the main screen wavered, then zoomed, the pixels struggling to resolve the image through the haze. There, half hidden behind a shuddering support pillar, a figure. They wore the same grimy, patched-up coveralls as everyone else, the uniform of the bellows. But their posture was different. They were not screaming. They were not running. They stood with a preternatural calm, their back to the camera, facing the grotesque, growing shrine. And they were chanting. Joran could just make it out, a low, resonant hum that was almost lost beneath the screaming, but was somehow, impossibly, the root of it. The figure's hands were moving, not in panic, but in slow, deliberate, placating gestures. A wave, a turn of the wrist, a cupping of the air, as if soothing a wild animal. Or
conducting an orchestra. A cantor, Joran whispered, the word tasting of metal and revelation. Everything in him clicked into place. The swirling, terrifying storm of inexplicable phenomena suddenly had a lighthouse. The horror flooding his senses receded, replaced by a wave of cold, clarifying anger. This wasn't a supernatural event. This wasn't some unknowable horror from the depths. This was an attack, a manufactured contagion deliberately released. It had a perpetrator. It had a methodology. And anything with a methodology could be dismantled. He felt a grim, familiar relief. He was no longer a helpless observer of cosmic madness. He was a hunter with a scent. "That one," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, filled with a sudden predatory focus. He tapped the screen, leaving a greasy fingerprint over the chanting figure. "That's the source, not a victim, an instigator." Brekker squinted at the screen. "Looks just as rust-rotted as the rest of them, maybe more." "The source of the pattern," Joran snapped, his gaze locked on the monitor. The figure made another gesture, a slow arc with their right hand, and on another feed, Joran saw 3 workers mimic the exact motion before throwing themselves into a grinding vat. He had his proof. He finally turned to Brekker, his eyes blazing with a fire that had nothing to do with the horrors on the screen and everything to do with the resurrected ghost of his own certainty. The fear was gone, burned away by rage. Anger was clean. Anger was useful. It was the only faith he had left. "Get me that one!" The shriek was a physical thing. It wasn't just sound. It was a pressure that bored into Brekker's sinuses and made the fillings in his molars vibrate with sympathetic agony. The sonic disruptors were running at full capacity, a wave of pure weaponized noise designed to shatter cognitive patterns, to break the feedback loop of the chant. Down below, in the soupy green-lit steam of the protein refinery floor, it wasn't working. Dozens of workers, their bodies swaying in a sick tidal rhythm, continued to hum their impossible chorus. The noise only seemed to make them more fervent. From his vantage point on the rust-eaten catwalk, Brekker Hoon felt the grating under his magboots tremble. Every rivet in the refinery seemed ready to shear off. Beside him, Vek and Lorne, his 2-man enforcement team, had their helmets sealed tight, their own internal dampeners whirring on overdrive. Brekker preferred to feel it. The pain kept him sharp. It was a bellows truth. Comfort was a lie that got you killed. The air tasted of ozone from the disruptors, hot metal, and the cloying, yeast-like smell of nutrient paste bubbling in the vats below. Everything was slick, with a film of warm, greasy condensation. "Target is static," Joran's voice crackled in his ear, tinny and detached. "1 level above you, grid 4 beta, watching, waiting. I don't like it." Brekker didn't need the grid reference. He'd already seen the figure, a smudge of gray against the pulsing green glow of a fungal cluster. They stood perfectly still on a higher gantry, a scarecrow silhouette looking down on the horror show. A member of the chorus. While Joran analyzed patterns, Brekker saw a predator surveying its trap. "Reluctance is a liability, enforcer." Joran's voice came again, as if sensing Brekker's hesitation. "This is our only lead to Kaelis Rendor. We need them alive, but we need them. Execute!"
Brekker's breath plumed in the humid air. He wasn't reluctant, he was professional. But the scene below, the sheer wrongness of it, flesh merging with machinery, voices harmonizing into something that scraped at the edges of his sanity. It churned the nutrient paste in his stomach. This wasn't a gang turf war or a kill-a-cow debt correction. This was something else, something rotten from the foundations up. "Vec, Lauren, pins of formation. You take the primary walkway. I'll flank via the maintenance line." Brekker's voice was a low growl, barely audible even over the comm. "Non-lethal. I want this one breathing." "Copy," Vec grunted, his heavy boots clanging as he and Lauren moved out, carbines held low. The moment they moved, the figure on the gantry snapped its head up. It had known they were there all along. With a fluid movement that was entirely out of place in this world of rusted angles and corroded steel, it turned and fled, not with panic, but with purpose. It vaulted a section of missing railing and disappeared behind a massive condenser unit leaking clouds of hot steam. "Target is mobile. On me!" Vec yelled, his voice distorted by the comm and the ambient shriek. Brekker ignored him. He watched their path. They were following the main artery of the catwalk system, a wide, obvious path. Amateurs. This refinery wasn't built like the neat schematics in the Arium. It was a bellows construct, a chaotic layering of retrofits, jury-rigged expansions, and unofficial shortcuts. It was a language he understood in his bones. He saw not a catwalk, but a web. He turned away from their pursuit, moving to a section of wall covered in thick, insulated pipes. The chorus member was fast, but they were running on the surface. Brekker was going to run through the walls. He found the access ladder he was looking for, half hidden behind a corroded junction box. The rungs were slick with algae. He hoisted a sidearm and began to climb, his augmented muscles taking the strain with ease. This was what HydroCorp is paid for, not just the muscle, but the instinct. The memory of a youth spent racing through filtration plants and generator housings, always one step ahead of some rival crew or a pissed-off foreman. The corporation had bought his past and repurposed it, honed it into a weapon. He squeezed through a narrow gap between two humming conduits, the heat pressing in on him. The shriek of the disruptors was muffled here, replaced by the deep, thrumming groan of the refinery's own heart. Drip, drip, drip. The sound was everywhere. Water, or something like it, seeped through a crack above, tracing a cold line down his neck. He moved faster, a shadow in the guts of the machine. He saw the chase through a section of mesh grating in the floor of the crawl space. Vec and Lorne were a good 20 meters behind the fleeing figure, their heavy armor slowing them on the treacherous surface. The chorus member was a wraith, leaping gaps, sliding under pipes, their ragged clothes catching the foul green light. They were leading his team toward the old reclamation furnace, a dead end of shattered walkways and a sheer drop into a simmering vat. A trap, either for his team or for the target themselves. Brekker wasn't waiting to find out. He pushed forward, crawling over a thick bundle of humming cables. Up ahead, a vertical maintenance shaft. He kicked the flimsy cover out and dropped down, landing with a solid thud on a lower catwalk, the impact jarring his knees. He was ahead of them now, perfectly positioned. He flattened himself into an alcove where a service panel had long since rusted away, the darkness swallowing his black composite armor. The air was thick with the metallic tang of decay. He controlled his breathing, slowing his heart. Waiting. The professional, the hunter. The reluctance was a distant memory, burned away by the heat of the chase. This was just a job. He heard the skittering footsteps first, light, quick. Then the figure shot around the corner. They were so focused on the sounds of pursuit behind them, they didn't see the wall of black armor in front of them until it was too late. They ran straight into him. The impact was negligible. Brekker's augmented frame didn't budge. The figure bounced off him, stumbling back with a choked gasp. For a split second, they just stared. Brekker saw wide, terrified eyes in a gaunt, dirt-smudged face. They were little more than a kid, swimming in oversized rags. Before they could scream, or run, or throw themselves over the edge, he moved. One hand shot out and grabbed a fistful of their tunic, the other snaked around their waist. They thrashed, a wild, desperate energy that had no real strength behind it. It was like holding a panicked bird. He smelled the fungal dampness on them, the scent of the stillness, of wet stone and things that grew in the dark. "No, the song! You're breaking the harmony!" The voice was a high-pitched whisper, raw and cracking. They twisted, trying to look back at the chaos below. Brekker just held on, pinning their arms. He was brutally, efficiently gentle. No blows, no unnecessary force. Just an immovable object meeting a frantic, desperate force. He pushed them back against the cold, sweating wall, their struggles weakening. They were surprisingly, terrifyingly frail, all sinew and bone. He could feel their heart hammering against his armored hand. "Vek, Lorne, stand down," he said into his calm, his voice flat. "I have the package." He pulled a pair of polymer restraints from his belt and expertly secured the figure's wrists. They finally went limp, a shudder running through their thin frame. Their heads slumped forward. Brekker looked down at his captive, then over the railing. The scene below was unchanged, a choir of the damned, singing to the rhythm of the groaning metal and the shrieking disruptors. For a moment, just a moment, beneath the wall of sonic agony, Brekker thought he heard it too. A faint, structured melody in the noise. A ghost in the machine. He keyed his comm again, his gaze fixed on the swaying bodies below. "Joran, target secured. Bring the cage." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. The interrogation space was a lie, like everything else in the bellows. It was a repurposed brine scrubber nexus, no larger than a maintenance closet, with the air thick with the smell of wet rust and ozone. A single, naked LED on a trailing wire cast stark shadows, its intermittent flicker making the condensation on the corrugated steel walls glitter like a fever dream. Water dripped from a corroded junction box overhead, a maddeningly rhythmic plink against the grated floor. It was a perfect microcosm of Haven, decaying, damp, and pretending to be something it wasn't.
Joran entered, letting the heavy door groan shut behind him. The sound echoed the groans of the arcology itself. In the center of the room she sat, the captured chorus member. Her hands were bound to the arms of the metal chair with standard-issue polymer cuffs. She was young, barely out of her teens, with the pallid complexion of a dampskin who'd spent her life under artificial light. Her hair was damp, plastered to her forehead. But her eyes, they were wrong. They weren't wild with fanaticism or vacant with indoctrination. They were calm, serene, and they followed him with an unnerving, pitying focus. He placed his datapad on a small rusted shelf, the metallic scrape loud in the confined space. He didn't need his notes. This was a script he'd perfected. "My name is Joran Vask," he began, his voice a clinical instrument. "I am the forensic theologian assigned by the Haven Authority Directorate to investigate the level gamma incident at Protein Refinery 7. You are being detained as a person of interest in the deployment of a Class 4 mimetic pathogen." She blinked slowly, a gesture of almost placid curiosity. No reaction, no denial. He felt a familiar flicker of irritation. A zealot's righteous fury was a vulnerability. This was just an absence, a void. "I need you to tell me about the weapon," he pressed, pacing the short length of the room. "The delivery system for the cognitive contagion. Was it airborne, a sonic trigger, a subliminal signal broadcast through the refinery's PA system?" The girl tilted her head. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Weapon?" she asked.
her voice soft, barely above the sound of the dripping water. "You think we used a weapon?" "I don't think," Joran snapped, his professional detachment fraying. "I know. I have seen the result. Dozens of workers, their minds overwritten, a refinery central processing unit, compromised, the flesh and the metal fused into a monument of biological blasphemy. That is not hysteria. That is engineered." "It is a defense," she said, her calm unwavering. It was like dropping a stone into the deep, viscous water of the stillness. No splash, no ripple. Joran stopped his pacing. He stared at her. A defense. The word was wrong. It didn't fit his diagnosis. A defense against what? Directorate control? Structured survivalism? The tyranny of a full nutrient-paced ration?
"Against the noise," she said simply. "Your noise." He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's clammy air. He thought of the sonic emitters Brekker's team had placed at the perimeter of the refinery, tuned to a frequency designed to disrupt neural cohesion, to break the patterns of a group chant. It was standard procedure. It always worked. "The sonic dampeners?" he asked, unable to keep the disbelief from his voice. "They are non-lethal deterrents. They disrupt concentration. They don't cause that." "You hear the city, theologian?" she asked, her eyes distant for a moment. "The groan of the pylons, the hum of the purifiers. It is all a song, a deep, slow, sleeping song. We were trying to soothe it, to deepen the harmony." Her gaze returned to him, sharp and clear. "We were singing it a lullaby." Joran felt his own thoughts begin to stutter. Lullaby, song. This was the lexicon of faith, the poetry of delusion he was so adept at dissecting. He had to get back on script. "This lullaby," he said, forcing the word out like a piece of grit, "had a mimetic payload. It was designed to infect, to overwrite." "No." The word was soft but absolute. "The song is always there. It's the dreamer, sleeping in the brine. All we do is listen, and we sing back, so it does not feel alone, so it does not wake. But you came with your noise." She leaned forward slightly, the polymer cuffs creaking. "You cannot hear it, can you, the song? So you can't possibly understand what you did. Your machines didn't just disrupt us, they stabbed into the melody, a loud, sharp, disharmonious note of pure pain." The dripping water seemed to slow. Joran's heart hammered against his ribs. Pain. He remembered the moment the biomechanical growth had erupted, a wave of pulsing, coral-like flesh consuming the machinery. The chanting sickness hadn't escalated until after he had deployed the sonics. "The dreamer was in pain," she continued, her voice taking on a quality of deep, resonant sorrow. "It hurted. What you saw in the refinery, the flesh reaching for the metal, was not an attack. It was a reflex, the way you would wrap your arms around yourself if you were called, the way a wound scabs over to protect itself. It was a desperate attempt to silence the agony you were causing."
Joran felt the floor shift beneath his feet. Or perhaps it was his entire worldview. He had seen the evidence through the lens of his own guilt, his own history with the silent choir. He had seen a weapon, an attack, a virus. He had defined the problem to fit his solution. But she was presenting a scenario where he wasn't the doctor. He was the disease. "That's impossible," he whispered, the words hollow. It was a desperate prayer to the God of reason. "Is it?" The pity in her eyes was unbearable now. It was the look of someone watching a man argue with a tidal wave. You heard something you didn't understand, and your first, only instinct was to make it stop. You call us a cult, but your faith in your own methods is more blind than anything I have ever seen. You believe a scream can be cured with more screaming." He wanted to shout at her, to list the scientific principles she was violating, to throw the DSM-12 diagnostic criteria at her until her serene expression shattered. But the words wouldn't come. His certainty, the bedrock of his identity, was fractured. All he could see was the sequence of events, the chanting, his interference, and the explosive transformation. A leads to B, leads to C. His logic, for the first time, was not his ally, it was his accuser. He felt dizzy. The ozone smell was suffocating. The dripping water was the ticking of a clock he had wound and set himself. "The lullaby is broken, theologian," she said, her voice now just a flat, factual statement. "Because of you. You turned it into a shriek, and a shriek is so much easier for others to hear." Joran backed away, his hand finding the cold steel of the door. He had to get out. He had to think. But the logical pathways in his mind were flooded. He saw the flesh and metal not as a tumor, but as a scar. He heard the chanting not as a vector, but as a balm. And he saw his sonic emitters not as medicine, but as the knife that had caused the wound. He stumbled out of the room, not bothering to close the door, leaving her in the flickering light. The deep hum of the arcology seemed louder now, more present. It wasn't just background noise anymore. It was a sound. And for the first time, he was terrified he might be starting to hear the tune.
The quarantine observation post was a sterile insult to the decay surrounding it. A polymer and steel blister grafted onto the corroded flank of the bellows. Its air scrubbers hummed a clean, monotonous tune that fought a losing battle against the omnipresent smell of brine and rust. Inside, the only light came from the sickly green glow of a central analysis console. Joran Vask was a ghost haunting its luminescence, his reflection a pale, hollow-eyed mask on the dark screen. He had been here for 6 hours. The initial adrenaline of the containment breach, the sonic blast, the horrifying biomechanical fusion in the refinery had long since curdled into a familiar, gritty resolve. Every crisis had a cause, every phenomenon a pathology. His job was to find it, name it, and cut it out. It was the only thing that kept the ghosts of his own past from whispering in the constant rhythmic drip of condensation that echoed through Haven. "Isolate event marker 7 Sigma Niner," he muttered, his voice a dry rasp. "Disruptor pulse activation." The console chimed, and a section of the timeline display expanded. A jagged, multi-layered graph filled the screen, depicting the last moments before the refinery section was sealed. It was a chaotic symphony of data streams, ambient decibels, atmospheric particulates, structural resonance frequencies. He muted them one by one with sharp, practiced taps, silencing the digital noise until only 2 lines remained. One was a sharp, clean spike, a needle of emerald green. Input: the total energy discharged by the 3 sonic disruptor units, 4.2 megajoules, precisely calibrated, a controlled scientific response to a psychological contagion. The other line was a monster. It began a microsecond after the green spike, a rising tide of angry crimson data that dwarfed the input signal. It wasn't a spike, it was a tidal wave, a jagged mountain peak that screamed off the chart. Joran stared at it, his focus narrowing until the humming scrubbers and dripping water faded into nothing. He had seen sensor blowouts before, signal bleed from a crossed power conduit, resonance feedback loops that tricked the sensors into recording phantom energy. It was a common problem in the jury-rigged arcology. This had to be one of them. "Run diagnostic subroutine Epsilon," he commanded the console. "Cross-reference sensor integrity against power grid fluctuations for the corresponding timestamp."
Lines of code scrolled past, a waterfall of sterile logic. The console chimed again, a flat, neutral tone that felt like a judgment. Sensor array, nominal. Power grid, stable. No fluctuations detected. Data integrity, 99.8%. Joran's jaw tightened. 99.8%. Within acceptable parameters. Well within acceptable. He leaned closer, the ozone smell from the console's vents sharp in his nostrils. His own system of belief, the structured survivalism the directorate preached, was built on the unshakable laws of physics. They were the one true faith in a world of rust and despair. And the first, most sacred commandment was the conservation of energy. Energy is not created from nothing. It is not conjured from prayer or summoned by chanting. It is transferred, it is converted. It is always, always accounted for. He pulled up the output calculation. The number bloomed on the screen, a glowing obscenity. 113.7 megajoules. He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. A 27-fold return. It wasn't a feedback loop. It wasn't a sensor error. It was alchemy. It was a miracle. It was impossible. "No," he whispered to the empty room. "No, the model is wrong." His fingers flew across the holographic interface, his movements becoming frantic. He brought up the schematics of the protein refinery. He manually input the material composition of the vats, the pipes, the catwalks, all the metal the infected workers had somehow woven into their pulsating shrine. He added the estimated biomass of the 17 workers. He ran a simulation. A new graph began to draw itself on the screen. Calculate maximum potential chemical and kinetic energy release from system components catalyzed by 4.2 megajoules sonic input, he ordered, his voice strained. He watched the line crawl across the screen. It was a pathetic little hill next to the crimson mountain of the actual recorded event. The simulation peaked at a paltry 5.1 megajoules, accounting for the structural collapse of the machinery and a theoretical, impossibly efficient biochemical reaction from the workers themselves. It accounted for nothing.
Where did the other 108 megajoules come from? The question was a physical presence in the room, sucking the air from his lungs. The energy had to come from somewhere. An unlisted power line? He pulled up the full arcology grid schematics. The refinery sector was powered by a single, isolated substation. There was nothing else. No hidden conduits. No secret military projects. He checked geothermal resonance, solar flare activity, atmospheric pressure anomalies. Every stray variable his system could track, nothing, nothing, nothing. His disciplined, ordered mind, the one thing he had left, was being presented with a data point that it could not classify. It was like a biologist discovering a creature with no DNA, or a mathematician proving 2 + 2 = a color. It was a fundamental violation. His gaze drifted to the polymer glass viewport. It looked out over the sealed-off refinery level. The emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows. But at the heart of the sealed zone, a soft, rhythmic blue-green light pulsed. The shrine, the source. It was still active, still glowing with a light that had no business existing. The light of impossible energy. His mind flashed back to the incident. The sound. He'd classified it as a mass auditory hallucination, a psychoacoustic trick of resonance and suggestion. But he remembered the feeling, the pressure in his bones, the air growing thick like the viscous, non-rippling water he'd seen in the stillness. A physical force pushing back against the sonic disruptors. A force powered by what? By belief? By the chorus of the brine? The thought was so absurd, so antithetical to his entire existence, that he felt a bubble of hysterical laughter rise in his throat. He choked it down. Faith did not generate megawatts. Faith was a system flaw in the human cognitive machine, a comforting lie in the face of a meaningless, thermodynamic universe slowly winding down to zero. It was a disease, and he was the physician. He spun back to the console. He ran the primary analysis again. The results loaded instantly, already cached in the system's memory. The same green needle, the same crimson mountain. Input 4.2, output 113.7. The numbers glowed, mocking him. They were the answer, but the question they answered was one he was terrified to even ask.
The shout was torn from him, a raw sound of pure frustration. He slammed his fist down on the console, not on the keyboard, but on the solid frame beside it. A sharp crack echoed in the small room. A spiderweb of fractures bloomed in the console's casing, and the holographic display flickered violently. For a second, the crimson mountain vanished. Joran held his breath, a wild, irrational hope flaring in his chest. Let it be broken. Let the machine be the flaw. But the display stabilized, and the data returned. Unchanged. Undeniable. Irrefutable. He stared at his hand. His knuckles were raw, a smear of blood on the white polymer. The pain was a distant, secondary sensation. The primary feeling was a cold, terrifying freefall. His resolve had shattered. In its place was a chasm of cognitive dissonance. The data was real. The event was impossible. Both were true. The groaning of Haven's deep pylons, a sound he had long ago learned to ignore, suddenly seemed articulate. It wasn't the sound of stressed metal. It was the sound of something vast and ancient, stirring in its sleep. He looked at the glowing numbers on the screen, the evidence of a power that obeyed no laws he knew. For the first time since he had found his family in the silence of their apartment, Joran Vask felt the terror of being truly, utterly wrong. The holocall made Otho Valerius look like a ghost sculpted from television static. His face, a meter tall and shimmering in the damp air of the makeshift bellows command post, was a mask of cold fury. Behind his crisp holographic form, the sterile white and polished steel of his Ethereum office were a silent, mocking testament to a world Joran no longer inhabited. Here in the gut of the city, the only light came from the flickering emitter and the sickly green phosphorescence of fungal patches clinging to the corroded wall. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and wet rust.
and a single fat drop of condensation fell from a sweating pipe every 7 seconds, striking a metal plate with a percussive tick that was drilling into Joran's skull.
A complete systemic failure, Joran. That's the only way to describe it. Otho's voice was digitally sharpened, cutting through the low groan of the arcology's stressed pylons. Your clinical observation has resulted in the permanent loss of a Tier 1 protein refinery. The machinery hasn't just stopped, it's fused. It's part of that shrine? Joran flinched internally. He had seen it. The grotesque biomechanical sacrament, where the bodies of the infected workers had become living conduits, their flesh flowing like melted wax into the refinery's catalytic converters, creating a single, pulsating organism of man and machine that hummed with a resonant frequency that made his teeth ache. It was a data point that fit nowhere, an impossibility he had to ignore. The quarantine's failure was a foregone conclusion, Joran said, his own voice sounding hollow and strained. He kept his posture rigid, a futile attempt to project a control he did not feel. The vector was never biological. It was mimetic, weaponized. Spare me the theological jargon, Vask. This is a public health crisis. No, it isn't, Joran countered, taking a step closer to the shimmering apparition. This was it. The precipice. He had to make Otho see. He had to make himself believe. This wasn't a spontaneous outbreak. This was an attack. The chorus of the Brine didn't just stumble upon this. They designed it. And one man is at the center of it all. Elis Render. Otho's holographic features tightened with skepticism. A faint wash of static rolled across his face. The cult's leader? A ghost? A bogeyman the ungrounded used to scare their children? You're proposing a damp-skinned fanatic living in the flooded ruins orchestrated a mimetic plague that bypassed directorate hygiene protocols? He's not just a fanatic. He is patient zero. He is the architect. Think of the pattern, Otho, the slow infection, the gradual escalation. This was a controlled deployment. He has turned faith into a contagion, and Haven is his test subject. Otho Valerius went still. The fury in his spectral eyes did not vanish, but was submerged, sinking beneath a new layer of cold, predatory calculation. The air in his pristine office was so quiet that Joran could hear the faint, high-frequency hum of the emitter. It was the silence of a predator that has just spotted new, more interesting prey. A terrorist, Otho said. The word was alien in his vocabulary of systems and metrics. He tested its weight, its shape. You are no longer classifying this as a cognitive virus, you are classifying it as sedition. Joran felt a cold dread mix with a strange, sour relief. Otho wasn't accepting the facts, he was accepting the narrative. He saw the path Joran was unwittingly laying for him, a way out, a way to reframe catastrophe as conflict. His goal is to destabilize the arcology, Joran said, committing to the lie that felt more true than the impossible reality of a biomechanical shrine. The chanting sickness is the weapon. Rendor is the hand on the trigger. A thin, bloodless smile touched Otho's lips. It was the most terrifying expression Joran had ever seen on him. A disease is an admission of failure, Vask. It suggests the environment is beyond our control. It breeds a specific kind of hopelessness, a breach of mental hygiene on a mass scale. But a terrorist is an enemy, an external threat, and an enemy is something we can rally against, something we can be seen to defeat. He doesn't care if it's true,
The thought screamed in the back of Joran's mind. He only cares that it's useful. The realization was like swallowing brine. He was being handed a weapon, not to find the truth, but to manufacture a more palatable one. For the Directorate, for himself. "Give me the resources," Joran said, his voice now a low rasp. "Full authority, unrestricted access to the unmonitored sectors of the bellows, all the way down to the stillness. I need a tactical unit, not medics." "Done," Otho replied, the word a gunshot in the sterile silence of his end of the call. "You'll have your unit. Hydrocorpus is providing one of their own enforcers to act as your liaison and bodyguard, a specialist in bellows pacification and ungrounded culture. Name's Brekker. Consider his leash yours."
Joran's datapad chimed, a notification sliding across the screen. Directorate Special Order 77A Alpha. Full authority granted. All sectors. A blank check, signed with the city's failing lifeblood. Otho's image leaned forward, the static thinning, making his features unnervingly clear. He was a confessor now, or perhaps a tempter. The line was blurring. "This is no longer an investigation, Joran. It is a manhunt. Find this Kalis Rendor. Prove your theory. Give the Directorate a victory, and give the people of Haven a villain to hate instead of a reality to fear. Cut the head off the snake. Do not fail me again." The connection severed. Otho's ghost vanished, plunging the small room into a disorienting darkness, punctuated only by the weak green glow from the walls. The silence that rushed in was heavier than the noise had been. It was filled with the groaning of the city, the eternal rhythmic tick, tick, tick of the water drop, and the crushing weight of Joran's new, absolute authority. He looked down at the datapad in his hand. The screen's white light illuminated his trembling fingers. He had his crusade. He had the power to chase the ghost that would, he prayed, rationalize the madness. But the victory felt hollow, a transaction performed in bad faith. He had just been sanctioned to hunt a man, not because he was the proven cause, but because he was the necessary enemy. A deep, resonant groan vibrated up through the floor, as if the very foundations of the arcology were sighing in despair. Joran felt it in his bones. He was no longer a scientist. He was now a weapon, aimed by a politician, and loaded with his own desperate lies. The air in the temporary observation post was thick with the smell of scorched metal and ozone, a sterile violence that couldn't quite mask the bellow's perpetual scent of wet rust and fungal decay. Beyond the reinforced polymer glass, the protein refinery stood like a tomb under the harsh glare of Directorate work lamps. Their white beams cut through the ambient blue-green mist, turning the condensation on every surface into a glittering skin of diamonds.
Joran Vask stood motionless, his hands clasped behind his back. He watched the Directorate crew, figures in heavy environmental suits moving with grim efficiency. They weren't cleaning, they were entombing. A massive slab of reclaimed ship steel, easily 3 meters square, was being guided into place by a groaning hydraulic crane, ready to cover the main entrance to Refinery 7. The high-pitched scream of a plasma welder arced across the gloom, showering the catwalk with a brief, furious cascade of orange sparks.
He should have been writing his report. That was the protocol. Subject: preliminary assessment of pathological belief structure, sector Gamma 9 refinery. He could almost see the words on his datapad. He would use the standard lexicon: mimetic contagion, cognitive feedback loop, mass psychogenic illness. He would construct a neat, orderly architecture of rational explanation around an event of sublime, screaming chaos. He would build a cage of words. But the animal was already out. The words were ash in his mouth now, hollow, useless. His entire discipline, forensic theology, felt like a child's attempt to diagram a hurricane with a piece of chalk. What was the proper term for a choir of workers who had sung themselves into the very machinery of the refinery? What clinical diagnosis covered flesh and steel weaving together into a new biological architecture that pulsed with a soft internal light? A shrine, a living, breathing, groaning shrine to a god he had provoked. Even from here, 50 meters away and through layers of steel and sound-dampening polymer, he could feel it. Not hear it, feel it. A low rhythmic thrumming in the bones of his feet transmitted through the deck plating. A deep, slow pulse. Thump, thump. The refinery had a heartbeat. He had listened to the captured cultist, the one from the chorus of the Brine, and heard only the ravings of a zealot. "You have introduced a disharmonious song." He had logged it as a threat, a premeditated psychological attack. Arrogance. Such profound, terminal arrogance. It wasn't a threat. It was a diagnosis. He was the contaminant. His scalpel of logic had slipped, and he'd severed an artery he didn't even know existed. A voice crackled in his earpiece, tinny and impersonal. "Vask, this is Quarantine Command. Supervisor Greel. We are commencing the final plasma seal on the main access. Do you require any further observation or sample retrieval?" Joran didn't turn from the window. His eyes were fixed on the dark, gaping maw of the refinery, soon to be covered forever. Samples. He almost laughed. What sample could possibly contain this? A piece of the pulsating wall? A biopsy of a worker whose nervous system had become a living circuit board? No, the disease wasn't in the room. The disease was the room. It was the air, the water, the belief. It was a new form of physics he had no mathematics for. "Negative, Supervisor." Joran's voice was flat, devoid of its usual academic precision. It was a worn, gravelly thing. "Seal it." "Acknowledged. Sealing now. Your preliminary report is expected by 0600. The line went dead. 0600. Joran watched as the plasma welder began its work, its blindingly bright tip tracing a line of molten fire around the edge of the steel plate. The report wouldn't be filed. That man, Joran Vask, the forensic theologian, was a ghost. He had died in the silent choir incident years ago. The man who walked around afterwards was just an elaborate mechanism built of guilt and denial. Now the mechanism had finally broken down. The complex, soul-crushing weight of an impossible reality, an ancient submerged consciousness, a song that reshaped matter, a faith that was not a delusion but a fundamental force. It was too much to bear. The human mind wasn't built for that scale of truth. It shattered. So it did what any organism does to survive. It simplified. His mind, in its desperate act of self-preservation, discarded the unanswerable what and latched on to the tangible who.
The entity in the deep brine was an equation with too many variables. It was God, or geology, or a hallucination on a planetary scale. It was everything and nothing. It was incomprehensible. But a man was different. Kalis Rendor, leader of the chorus of the brine, the one who had tried to manage the song, the one who understood. Patient Zero.
The term surfaced in his mind like a piece of salvaged metal from the deeps, ugly and rusted but solid. It was a term from his old world, his old beliefs, a point of origin, a vector, a single isolatable source of infection. It was a lie, he knew, a profound, self-serving lie. Kalis Rendor hadn't started this. He was just the first to hear the music. But a lie you can act on is more useful than a truth that paralyzes you. The screaming of the welders stopped. A final, heavy clang echoed through the bellows as the magnetic clamps were released. It was done. The refinery was a sarcophagus. But the faint, deep pulse continued, a secret known only to the dead inside and the broken man watching from outside. Thump, thump. Joran's focus narrowed. The sprawling existential horror receded, compressed into a single sharp point. The face of Kalis Rendor, imagined from descriptions. A fanatic, a shepherd, a man who held the key. He was no longer a specimen to be studied. He was no longer a puzzle to be solved. He was prey. The frantic intellectual, the desperate debunker, the guilt-ridden scientist, all of that sloughed away like dead skin. What was left was colder, harder, simpler. A predator doesn't need to understand the ecosystem. It only needs to know the scent of its quarry. He had traded the vast, terrifying pursuit of truth for the simple, clean pursuit of a man. It was a choice that would doom Haven. He knew it, on some level. He knew he was taking the easy path, the violent path, the path that led away from understanding and toward simple, brutal catharsis. He was abandoning the chess game for the knife fight, because he had already been checkmated and couldn't bear to admit it. He turned from the window. The reflection showed a stranger. The face was gaunt, the eyes hollowed out but burning with a new chilling light. It was not the face of a thinker. It was the face of a hunter. The intricate, agonizing questions of faith, reality, and sanity were gone, replaced by a single declarative statement, a new mission. He keyed his private comms, opening a secure channel to the only person he could trust now, the only one who understood loyalty over protocol, Brekker Hoon. His voice was a quiet promise of violence in the sudden silence of the observation post.
Brekker, I know what we have to do now. There are no more theories, no more analysis. We're going to find Kalis Rendor, and we're going to end this. Keep your footing.
He cut the connection before the enforcer could reply. The hunt had begun.